Good evening, everyone. I'm Richie Davidson, and I am the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also the founder of Healthy Minds Innovations, our affiliated nonprofit. It's really so wonderful to be joining with all of you this evening. We're living in probably the most challenging time in history that any of us has ever lived in. There are many challenges. The suffering is just extraordinary. And yet there are silver linings. One of the silver linings is that we can convene virtually in this way. We have people from all over the world joining us tonight. There are people from Australia, from Russia, Siberia, from different parts of Europe, from Central and South America, from different parts of the United States, from Australia. And so this is truly a global community, and we're really honored and thrilled to have you all join us here this evening. The research in our organization is dedicated to the goal of a kinder, wiser, and more compassionate world. This is why we do the work we do. The title of this series of events over the next 5 days is The World We Make. And this idea is simply the notion that our minds create our worlds. And if we can transform our minds, we can transform the world. Despite the challenges and difficulties which we're facing today, we can envision a post-pandemic world, a world that is based truly on justice, a world where well-being is prioritized. We can envision such a world, and we can act in whatever ways each of us can to help promote this vision that I think all of us participating in this event this evening share. So we are going each night over the course of 5 days to talk about different aspects of the work in our center and our nonprofit. And this is on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of our center. It was 10 years ago that His Holiness the Dalai Lama came to Madison, Wisconsin to help us inaugurate the launching of this center. And this center is really embodying the dream that we can bring together science and the wisdom from the contemplative traditions to catalyze change and to support this change through rigorous scientific research so that we can actually cultivate well-being and enable humans to flourish, since most of us, I think, would agree that the trajectory that we've been on is a problematic one with challenges in so many different places. And one of the potential opportunities of the COVID challenge that we now face is that this will be a wake-up call for the planet to turn its attention in other directions and prioritize the importance of human flourishing. I'd like to begin this evening by thanking our sponsors for this event. We have many sponsors who have helped us: Chris and Sarah Fortune, the MG&E Foundation, Jim and Judy Hirsch, the Outrider Group, the QTI Group, Atomic Object, and Delta, all of whom have provided support to enable us to come together this evening. We encourage you to join us each evening at 7 o'clock. These programs will only be an hour or an hour and 15 minutes. We know we've been glued to our screens much too much during this pandemic. So by spacing it out over 5 days, we thought we can help to minimize screen fatigue. The last evening, on Friday evening, we're very honored to present for the first time a very recent dialogue that I filmed just a few weeks ago with His Holiness the Dalai Lama on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of our center. And I will be joined in showing clips from that dialogue with my dear friend and colleague, Dakila Chunglapa, who is the director of our Loka initiative, which you'll hear more about during one of the evenings over this week. After this evening and each evening, we'll have time for questions and answers. So please jot them down. You can write them in the chat box and they will be read to us after the dialogue. The topic for tonight is plasticity of mind, brain, and body. And I'm really happy, really thrilled to have joining me this evening a dear friend, a student, a former student, and a recent addition to the core faculty of the Center for Healthy Minds, Melissa Rosenkranz.
Richie, thank you for
Great to see
inviting
you,
me.
Melissa. You have to unmute yourself at some point.
I am unmuted.
Can we hear you? Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So I first met Melissa when she was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she came to work in our lab and actually worked on a study which turned out to end up being the most highly cited scientific publication in my career. I can assure you that while I think this study is important, it wasn't our best science, but it was it happened to be the right study to do at the right time. And it was the very first randomized controlled trial of mindfulness-based stress reduction, the most commonly taught form of mindfulness meditation in the West. And Melissa was part of that study. The results of that study were published in 2003, and they showed that just a short amount of practice over the course of 2 months, a total of around 25 to 30 hours of practice, was sufficient to induce measurable changes in brain function and also changes in immune function. And specifically in this case, it was changes in how people responded to the influenza vaccine, a topic of potential importance for our current situation today. And what we found in that study is that just 2 months of practice was sufficient to produce a measurable difference in how people responded to the influenza vaccine. The meditators actually showed a boost in their antibody titers compared to their controls. Melissa was part of that early study, and I think that it influenced the direction of her career. Melissa has been deeply interested in how the mind and the brain and the body are all connected, and she has exemplified that both in her science as well as in her own life. She is really a remarkable woman of so many talents. She has done the Ironman twice. She has been on long-term meditation retreats, and she is a scientist of impeccable quality. And so it was amazing to have the opportunity to actually have Melissa join our faculty. And it's great for you to be here this evening to start us off on this dialogue. So welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, Richie. And if I had known how lucky I was way back in, what was it, 1998 to join that study, I'm sure I would have messed it up for myself.
So Melissa,
but I'm happy to
tell us a little bit about your journey and what the important influences were in your early career in getting you to the place you're at now. And then we can talk a little bit about some of the work you're currently doing. But I think it would be interesting for people to hear a little bit about your trajectory and also about this kind of mind, brain, body science that you are doing, which really is so unusual. And it would help the viewers to understand a little bit about why it is so unusual. And part of it has to do with the methodological challenges, which you have certainly successfully navigated. But why don't you begin by sharing a little bit of your early times?
Sure. Well, when I said how lucky I was to join that study back in 2003, it was lucky because at the time I was just a 21-year-old with big ideas about what I thought was important in the world, and one of those ideas was that our minds have incredible power over our bodies, and I believed that was true. I really didn't know a fraction of what I know now. And I really didn't know that was something that I could pursue as a career. And so I was extremely fortunate to find myself in the happy circumstance of being hired as a research assistant to work on the lab's first meditation study. And particularly the role that I played in that study was the immune component of that study, understanding what the role of the brain was in shaping the response to the influenza vaccine. And that really did go on to shape much of my career. I didn't know it at the time, but it really has. Now that work has transitioned into studying chronic inflammatory disease and what the role of the mind and the brain is in initiating chronic inflammatory disease and shaping the course of that disease over a lifetime. And at the time, as I said, I didn't realize that was something that you can study, but that has unfolded over time. The techniques that exist to do that have unfolded over time. When I started, neuroimaging was really in its infancy, and there was nobody answering these questions using humans, because you really couldn't study the brain in that way in humans at that time. But since that time, my work and the work of others in my field, the field now is called psychoneuroimmunology, has evolved such that we can answer some of those questions using neuroimaging tools to understand how the brain really shapes the function of the body. And I love that this event is called The World We Make, because the way that I think about the work that I do, the role of the mind and the role of the brain really is part of shaping the world that we inhabit in terms of our own health and well-being. And it's such an important piece of the puzzle to harness in understanding how our mind and our brain contribute to our illness, but also how our mind and our brain can be harnessed to prevent the deleterious aspects on our health, as well as to promote flourishing of our well-being.
Great, thank you. So maybe you can share a little bit about why inflammation is such an important area to focus on. Why inflammation? And also, maybe you can say a little bit about how you have actually studied inflammation. What are the different ways you've measured it?
Sure. Well, the way that I think about the the role of the mind and brain in this mind-brain-body connection is in many ways serving as a prediction device in and trying to determine, based on our previous experiences, based on our memories, based on our expectations, what the conditions that we're going to inhabit and what conditions our body will be in the next second, in the next minute, in the next hour or week, whatever the time scale that you're looking at is, and trying to best prepare our bodies for whatever that circumstance will be. And so inflammation is an important part of that process when it comes to the immune system, because inflammation is the first tool that our immune system has in preventing against invading pathogens. And so inflammation is really at work in all of our barrier tissues, the way that pathogens first enter our bodies in terms of our nose, our mouth, our gut. And that's important because when those signals are transmitted to our brain, and so our brain responds in a way to best protect us from the potential for invading pathogens. But what is interesting is that system evolved at a time when most of our stressors were things like being hunted by a predator or being attacked by a member of a rival tribe, or some sort of physical threat. And so it made so much sense for our brain to kind of preempt an injury, but with an inflammatory response, because that was likely to be the circumstance that our body would be in. And so by launching a preemptive inflammatory response, that would likely be protective. But today, the stresses that we face usually are not those types of physical stress that result in injury or exposure to pathogens. And so that launching of a preemptive inflammatory response now isn't really very helpful, unfortunately, and is probably one of the contributing factors in the rising rates of chronic inflammatory disease and just generally an inflamed state that so many people in the world experience and suffer from on a daily basis. And so the techniques that we're working on are both to understand what those connections are and then how to harness them so that we can prevent the negative effects of that chronic inflammation that can be caused by the stressors we experience in our daily life, and also to promote a more healthy balance of immune system function.
I think it would be helpful now to just say a couple of words, which I will do, to help viewers really appreciate what you've just described and elaborate on it a little bit. One of the evolutionary achievements that we all have as human beings is this big hunk of real estate in the front of our brain, which we call the prefrontal cortex. And that area of the brain is really important for prediction. Melissa talked about prediction. We know that the prefrontal cortex can anticipate the future. It also can reflect on the past. Psychologists and neuroscientists have called this mental time travel. And this is something that humans can do in a way that far exceeds what any other species is able to do. And it confers obvious advantages. But one of the disadvantages is that we can anticipate something in the future and worry about it. We can have anticipatory anxiety about it. We can ruminate about something in the past and have negative emotions associated with that rumination. And so our mental time travel can actually create an enormous amount of suffering. There was a famous book, which you know of, Melissa, that was written by a good friend of ours who is a biologist at Stanford, Robert Sapolsky, named Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the reason why zebras don't get ulcers, I'm sure our audience can guess, But the reason why is because they have a really puny prefrontal cortex. They can't do this mental time travel. And so they're actually living in the moment in a way that is much more difficult for people to do. And one of the things I often say, and if anyone in the audience has any evidence on this point, I'd be really interested in learning about it. But I think most of us would agree that the incidence of psychiatric disorders is much greater in humans than it is in any other species. And it's greater in humans because of this remarkable evolutionary achievement that we all benefit from, but also creates a lot of suffering. So one of the strategies that we have taken in our center is to examine specific practices that may help to train the mind and the brain in ways that would enable the prefrontal cortex to be harnessed, if you will, in more healthy ways, as opposed to the kind of anticipatory anxiety and worry and rumination that can lead to a lot of suffering, and as Melissa explained, can also activate the inflammatory response, even though there's nothing happening in our environment other than all the stuff going on in our head.
Yeah, and Richie, if I can just elaborate on that a little bit, I think it's so powerful to understand how important our expectations are for the functioning of our body. And so there are all kinds of super cool studies that show how radical the expectations that we have or what we believe is happening has on our actual physiology. And I could talk about all kinds of really interesting examples. But one that I think is really germane to the moment is I know of several such examples, but one was very vivid for me. And that's that someone who believed that they had been exposed to COVID and were very concerned about their likelihood to develop COVID and actually developed a fever and nausea and many symptoms consistent with COVID. And then later learned that they actually hadn't been exposed. And the point that I'm trying to make is not that this was psychosomatic at all, but just that the belief that something was happening in your body can actually bring about physiological changes that are consistent with that belief. And that is an example of when that can happen in a situation where your mind or your expectations or beliefs can harm or create harmful circumstances in your body, but that can also go in the other direction, where the expectation or your prior experience with something can create a protective context in your body as well. And that is, I think, one of the things that makes the work that we're doing in the center unique is, though we're not the only ones addressing this question, really trying to understand how we can intervene to harness those expectations and that power of the mind to promote health and well-being, and not just to have it be a neutral factor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. One of the coolest studies that I know of on the potential beneficial effects of expectation is a study that was done quite a few years ago. It was published in Science, a very prestigious journal, with Parkinson's patients. And what they did in this study is that these patients all had been given L-DOPA for the first time, which is a drug used to activate the dopamine system, which is where the disease resides in Parkinson's patients. And there are, particularly in the early stages of treatment with L-DOPA, there are really discernible consequences, beneficial consequences of taking L-DOPA. And what they did in this study is, soon after their initial doses of L-DOPA, they randomized the group to either receive placebo, so a sugar pill, or to continue receiving actual L-DOPA. And they measured the changes in their brain with a special brain scanning technique called positron emission tomography, where they're actually able to measure the dopamine release in the area of the brain that is specifically impacted, the nigrostriatal region, so that they can actually measure the consequence of this. And what they found, remarkably, is that when the patients were switched to placebo, they were initially showing as high an elevation in dopamine in the nigrostriatal region of the brain that the patients who are continuing to receive L-DOPA. It was around a 20% increase. This is really an amazing observation that illustrates how specific the power of expectation can be in transforming our brain. And one of the things that I spent a lot of time in the early part of my career regaling about was to help the lay public appreciate the kind of dualistic notions of mind and brain that we often have adopted in our culture, where we often think about well-being, for example, as something psychological, and it's not really sort of physical. And yet, all of your research, Melissa, shows that if it's psychological, it's also physical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And that power of expectation paired with the context is so incredibly powerful in bringing about the reality of the reality of your body, really, what's happening in your body. What Richie described with L-DOPA has also been shown in the immune system and immune conditioning, and it's been shown that actually is one of the things that inspired my entire career, is the ability to classically condition the immune system, much in the same way that Pavlov's dogs learn to salivate in response to the sound of a bell. You can do the same thing with an immune response. And just as Richie was describing the specificity of the release of L-DOPA in response to placebo, when that's what the patients were expecting, you can get the same effect with conditioning the immune response. And one classic example of this was Robert Ader's work, who was one of the founders of the field of psychoneuroimmunology. And he demonstrated that that when paired with a novel taste or scent, immune modulating drug could produce the same effects when the immunosuppressive drug was paired with a novel taste or scent. Then the participant was re-exposed just to the scent or taste alone, would actually show the same immune response as they would to a very potent drug. And it's very specific. And that has been used therapeutically in order to reduce the amount of drugs that that people with diseases that require drugs that are toxic to them have to take. It's also responsible for the phenomenon that people who are going through chemotherapy sometimes associate just driving up to the hospital where they receive chemo making them nauseous. That's an example of where that conditioning, that physiological conditioning, can be harmful. But we can take those same relationships and harness them for really positive effects. And that's where I see the really exciting dimension of this work. In fact, we have done some of that, not with conditioning, but with using mindfulness training as a way to improve asthma control in individuals who have moderate severity of asthma.
And so, before you talk about that, the work on asthma control, I want to just have a little bit more context and have the viewers appreciate how you actually came to study asthma. And so we at one point were reflecting on physical diseases that are major public health issues, where there is incontrovertible evidence to show that psychosocial stress can actually exacerbate the symptoms of the illness, and where there is very good measurable biological endpoints for the illness. And we thought that if we can identify an illness of this sort, it would be a good model system, if you will, for exploring mind-brain-body interaction. And for a variety of reasons, and what I should say, there are many illnesses which fit the bill, so to speak. But for a variety of reasons, we chose asthma, and this has become a major focus of your work, Melissa. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about sort of how we landed on asthma, why asthma is so useful, if you will, as a disease that is not only a disease where we can actually make a difference to improve the lives of asthmatics, but where it serves as a model for this kind of mind-brain-body interaction.
Sure. Yeah, asthma has been a part of my work really since the beginning, since I was a graduate student. And there are several factors that went into landing on asthma. And also one of the reasons why I've stayed at UW for so long, because this work has really flourished here. And there are a few reasons why it's flourished here. One is that we have at UW one of the best asthma research groups in the world. And it is, I've been very fortunate to be able to work with that group. And also that asthma, as you mentioned, Richie, is very vulnerable to stress and emotion-induced flare-ups. There's a high comorbidity between asthma and psychopathology, primarily anxiety and depression. If you have asthma, you're more than twice as likely to have anxiety or depression than somebody who does not have asthma. But one of the most important factors for me was really the crux of my career was focused on trying to understand the mechanisms through which this relationship happens. What are the neural pathways that give rise to this relationship? And in order to really study those mechanisms, you have to be able to study the disease process itself. And what's unique about asthma is that we can provoke exacerbation-like conditions in asthma without it being particularly risky for our participants or unpleasant, and without influencing really the course of their disease. And so to do this, we use what's called an inhaled allergen challenge, where our participants who have allergic asthma actually inhale what they're allergic to, and it provokes airway inflammation. And we can study their brain when they're in a non-inflamed state, and then we can study their brain using neuroimaging tools when they're experiencing airway inflammation. And we can see how their brain processes emotional information differently. In those two conditions, we can provoke a stressful experience and see how that impacts their response to inhaled allergen, which is a study that we've just wrapped up recently. And so there are a number of things that we can do with asthma. There are also very clear outcome measures, objective outcome measures in asthma, including measures of airway inflammation that we measure in local tissue through sputum or through bronchoscopy that we really can't do in chronic inflammatory diseases. For example, in rheumatoid arthritis, you can't really take a sample of the synovial fluid or the joint very easily. I mean, that's going to be very invasive for participants. They're not going to want to do it. It's not necessarily ethical, and provoking an episode in a disease like that does impact the course of the disease. That's not ethical to do, but we can do that.
Let me just interrupt you in the interest of time, because we only have a few more minutes
Oh, okay.
before we move on to questions. And I wanted to ask how different forms of meditation may change the mind and the brain in ways that might impact the inflammatory response in asthma. You've really been a pioneer in examining that question using the most rigorous tools we have available today. Tell us what you found.
Well, I think that one way to understand this is by thinking about the fact that the body is always sending signals up to the brain, informing it about the condition of the body and what it should be prepared for. And then the brain is responding, sending signals down to the body, regulating those same processes. So it's kind of a circle. You can think of it that way. One of the key, actually two of the key regions that are involved in this circle of communication are the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. And they're depending on one's psychological.
By the way, two regions of the brain that have important connections to different parts of the body.
Right. And so those you can sort of think of those two regions in some ways as sentinels that are on the lookout for threats that are coming, threats from the body primarily. And depending on the psychological state, they can be more or less sort of keyed up and sensitive to those incoming threats. And so you can imagine that a meditation practice that's focused, especially meditation practices that are maybe focused on the body, might have the impact of reducing the reactivity of those brain regions. And so when the brain is receiving these signals from the body, they're less likely to overreact, so to speak. And you have to keep in mind that this communication is bidirectional. So the signals are coming up from the body, but then the brain is responding and trying to prepare the body for what's to come next. And you can imagine that can get out of control if those brain regions are responding in a sort of an aggravated sort of way. But if you can reduce the reactivity of those brain regions, you have the potential to reduce sort of the domino effect of that cascading inflammatory response. And we actually have found evidence that those brain regions are involved in the processing of emotional information. And what we're trying to learn now is what are the neural circuits through which meditation can impact the outcome of the measurable outcome of a disease course. And we've used asthma for this purpose. And we have shown that just merely 8 weeks of beginning mindfulness training can improve asthma control. And this is both self-reported and objective measures of asthma control in terms of how much medication people are using, how many times they been woken up by their asthma in the night, how much inflammation they are having in their lungs. These objective measures of asthma that are used clinically are reduced in people who have undergone meditation training compared to people who have not. And sorry, do you want to chime in here, Richie?
We're going to need to wrap up in just a moment. There are a gazillion questions, so some of this can come out during questions and answers. But do you finish your final thought?
Yeah, I was just saying we're in the process now of trying to understand what has changed in the brain as a consequence of that meditation training that is related to the change in outcome measures that we're seeing in response to mindfulness training. So you'll have to stay tuned for the answer to that question.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Melissa. There are a lot of questions, I think. So I believe Sean will come on. Hello, Sean.
Hello,
Hi, Sean.
everyone. How are you? Thank you for joining us, everyone. Our first question comes tonight from Paulo, and that question is, what tools can be used to increase resilience and reduce psychological distress in those who cannot even sit briefly in silence?
Do you want to take that question, Richie, or do you want me to take it?
I'm happy to start, and you can add whatever you'd like.
Okay.
I would say that we're a great believer in the development, for example, the Healthy Minds program, of very short periods of practice to begin with. And so people often say that they can't sit still, they can't meditate. What we often will then say is, tell me what the minimum amount of time is that you feel you could sit and do this every day for at least 30 days, even if it's just 1 minute. That's one strategy. A second strategy is forget about sitting. Don't sit still. And you can engage in the same mental practices as you're engaged in other activities of daily living. Our Healthy Minds app, the Healthy Minds program app, which is freely available throughout the world, and someone will put a link to it in the chat box. If you take a look at this app, you will see that there are practices that you can do that are called active practices, which do not require you to sit for 1 minute. You can do them while you're walking, while you're washing the dishes, while you're doing your laundry, whatever it might be. So I would encourage you to explore these different options and figure out what may work best for you. Melissa, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I do. And in fact, I like that you talked about not having to do meditation sitting. One of my favorite ways to meditate is actually while exercising. So I'm a runner and a swimmer, and I love to focus on my mind and try to still my mind while I'm doing those activities. In fact, it makes them so much more enjoyable and profound, I feel like. But it's also important to realize that mindfulness meditation practices may not be for everyone. And there are lots of ways in which you can care for your mind and your well-being. So exercise is another one, spending time in nature. That often in and of itself, even without trying, does settle the mind in ways that being in the midst of a chaotic environment does not. Spending time connecting with others, I think, is another practice that we can do intentionally to cultivate our well-being. And these things that we don't think about as meditation or mindfulness type practices are actually components of what we're cultivating during the intentional meditation practices. And you can do them without even thinking about the fact that you're meditating or doing anything that you associate with a contemplative practice.
That's great. Okay, thank you. Next question, Sean.
Thank you for those insightful answers. Our next question comes from Asthma, and it is there research that shows differences between biological markers of stress, such as interleukins, and contemplative practices?
Melissa, you should take this.
Yeah, there is research showing associations between contemplative practices and changes in objective immune markers, if I understood that question correctly. The literature, to be honest, on that regard is very mixed. Some studies show changes and some studies do not. And it's important to realize that the immune system is it's there for a reason. So inflammation is not necessarily a negative thing. We need it. In fact, we would die without it. If you remember when I started this conversation, we talked about why inflammation is so important, particularly inflammation in barrier tissues. And so where you really tend to find effects is where you are studying people who have elevated inflammation to begin with. And there, you're finding sort of unhealthy levels of inflammation, a dysregulation, if you will, of the immune system that you're then reining in and bringing more under control. But when you're studying healthy populations, which a lot of this work is done in healthy populations, you don't tend to see changes in these inflammatory markers as often. It's usually in populations that are suffering from some inflammatory condition.
Thank you. Okay, next question.
Hello again, thank you. So the question we have is now, is breath-focused meditation advisable for asthmatics? Can focusing on breath for someone struggling with breathing a safe practicing technique?
That is a really good question. We have one data set to speak to that. a lot of the meditation that was taught in the intervention that we used with asthmatic participants used breath meditation. And I do think a lot of participants found it beneficial. I don't think I would say that it's unsafe.
And
But
just to be clear, it is mindfulness of breathing. It does not involve any manipulation.
Manipulation, right. And that's a really important distinction. Thank you for bringing that up, Richie. And I do think that is a really important distinction, because I do think manipulation of breathing may cause problems for some people who have asthma. But merely focusing on the breath, actually, many people with asthma find quite helpful. And I wouldn't think that there's anything unsafe about it, although everyone should be their own guide. And if they're finding, I'm imagining that that question maybe arose from the idea that focusing on breathing, particularly for somebody who's very new at it, may give rise to panic if one's airways feel tight. And drawing increased attention to that can maybe give rise to increased anxiety. And so if someone is experiencing that, they should back off and maybe try attention on a different aspect of their experience.
Thank you. Sean.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Next question is from Barbara. Can you train someone with really advanced chronic pain to stop their pain?
Thank you for that question. I will say, first and foremost, that the idea that meditation stops pain is not accurate. So my dear friend and teacher, John Kabat-Zinn, would always say that the idea of mindfulness is to change your relationship with your pain or your suffering. It's not going to make it go away. This is not a magic bullet. It's not magic at all. Really, it's changing your relationship with and the degree of suffering that's associated with the experience of pain, but it will not make the pain go away. I do think people who are suffering from very severe or advanced pain can be helped by these practices, just like someone who has more mild pain. It works the same way, but it isn't going to make it go away. It can help. Richie,
Great.
do you want to say anything about that?
I completely agree. So, yeah, thank you. Sean. You're on mute, Sean.
So sorry. There we go. How can you hear me? All right. Christopher ask, could you speak to the evidence of that rumination and anticipatory anxiety relating to chronic inflammation?
Well, I don't know of any specific evidence to speak to the relationship between rumination and anticipatory anxiety related to chronic inflammation, but theoretically, they're very closely related. When you think about the constructs that give rise to an inflammatory response, we know that the increased experience of stress causes a cascade in the body that causes release of inflammatory mediators. And one of the most striking effects, actually, that is really permeating the literature right now is the effects of early childhood adversity on inflammatory markers and the development of inflammation across the lifespan. And this being one of the ways in which early childhood adversity leads to all of the myriad impacts that it has across one's lifespan. And so I think that rumination and anticipatory anxiety are sort of two parts to this much bigger picture of this psychological sense of threat that we're prepared for constantly, that puts our body in a state of being prepared for injury. And it just isn't a good match for the circumstances that we're actually in that lead to these situations of dysregulated inflammation.
And maybe we'll have time for one more question. So, Sean, if you can please give us a last question. You're on mute again.
So sorry about that. Windhorse Health Clinic says, have your studies shown a connection between inflammation and overstimulation of sympathetic nervous system? If that makes sense to you.
Yep, there is a lot of literature showing that. So there are several pathways through which the experience of psychological stress and emotion more generally gives rise to inflammation in the body. And one of the major pathways involved in that is sympathetic nervous system activation. So the sympathetic nervous system innervates immune organs in the body and the bone marrow, which can influence the lineage of different cells that are emerging from the bone marrow, participating in inflammatory processes. And the neurotransmitters and chemicals that are released from the sympathetic nervous system are known to be catalysts for activating inflammation in the body. So yes, the sympathetic nervous system is definitely involved.
So thank you so much. And, we have 10 minutes left. We're going to do a little practice, but I want to ask you one question, Melissa, before we end. You're involved now in some work that truly is path-breaking and has enormous public health implications. And to sort of preview it and just to ask a question about it, one of the issues which you're exploring is whether the local inflammation that we see in a disease like asthma may provoke or may be associated with a more systemic inflammation, which can include inflammation in the brain, which can actually accelerate neurodegeneration and produce premature brain aging, as well as various forms of dementia and cognitive decline. And so I wonder if you can just share with us whatever you can in just 2 minutes, and what the implications of that work might be for how contemplative practices, which may be an antidote to some of this, may have a salubrious effect in modulating those processes and actually leading to better brain health.
Yeah, so this is an area of research that's occupying a lot of my time these days, is this idea that inflammation in the body provokes inflammation in the brain. And this has been shown in a variety of different models. And I'm not the only one studying this question. But the evidence does suggest that inflammation in the body, and including asthma, does provoke inflammation in the brain. And inflammation in the brain is one of the factors that's associated with all different sorts of neurodegeneration, including neurodegeneration associated with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, as well as other types of neural degradation. And I'm not suggesting that we know that asthma leads to these long-term consequences. It's a question we're pursuing right now. But if this does bear out, if our hypotheses are right, it suggests that asthma, as only one disease that affects about 10% of the population, may be at greater risk for dementia than they would otherwise. And that has all sorts of implications for public health and public policy, including how we manage those diseases. But one of the ways that we can manage those diseases is through these contemplative practices. And we now have evidence that asthma can improve, or that meditation can improve asthma control and reduce airway inflammation. If that is true, it can be one tool in the armamentarium of protecting our brains against premature aging and the neural degradation that may be associated with chronic inflammation in the body. And I think a really, really important area of pursuing.
Great. So thank you so much, Melissa.
Oh, thank you.
So we're going to end this evening with a little bit of practice, which I will happily guide. We have people from all over. It's so wonderful to see you. And I'd like to invite you to sit in an upright posture, to perhaps close your eyes. Since we are looking at screens all the time, we can give our eyes a rest. But if you feel more comfortable with your eyes open, that's fine too. And let's begin by simply settling in our bodies and bringing awareness into our bodies, checking in with how we're doing. And as we begin this short period of practice together, it's often helpful to remind ourselves why we're here. Why did we all make the intentional choice to gather together this evening? And let's see if we can find within us the recognition that calming our mind and opening our heart is beneficial not only for ourselves, but it's beneficial for all of the beings that we touch directly and indirectly. So let's spend a few moments seeing if we can find this altruistic motivation for doing this practice. During this time of the pandemic, there is great suffering and so many challenges around us. In order to live our daily lives, we depend on so many others, perhaps to deliver packages to our house, frontline medical care workers, folks who deliver the mail, whoever they may be, neighbors who help us in one way or another, our children, our parents, and let's bring one or two people who have been helpful to you during this time into our mind and heart. And let's allow this sense of appreciation to be present, appreciating all they're doing to be helpful at this time. And let's extend this circle of appreciation to include all of those who've joined this evening. People from far-flung places on the planet, Siberia to Australia to Mexico, and many, many others, who all share, I think, a common vision of a kinder, wiser, and more compassionate world. And let's extend this appreciation to all of us for what each of us is doing to help nudge the world in a healthier direction. So for those of you whose eyes have been closed, please open them. And I want to end by thanking everyone for joining us this evening. I'd like to remind you again that we're doing different events each evening at 7 o'clock Central US time. Tomorrow's event will be on the developing mind, and we're going to be exploring how inequality affects the emotional health of children and their families, specifically looking at the effects of poverty and trauma on the developing brain and what we can do about it. We hope this free event was valuable to you, and we encourage you to share this with your friends and family. And for more information about us, please connect with us on our websites, which are illustrated here in this slide. Follow us on social media. And of course, our work is only possible because of the generosity of people like you. We rely on supporters for our research and to produce events of the sort that we're doing. So please consider becoming a supporter of Healthy Minds and enable this to spread and become truly a global movement. So thank you all so much, and a deep bow of gratitude to the many people in our center behind the scenes who have played a role in making this possible. And finally, to Melissa Rosenkranz, an extraordinary young scientist who is at the leading edge of work on mind-brain-body interaction. So thank you.
Thank you for including me, Richie. It's been so fun to have this conversation with you tonight.
Wonderful to have you. Thank you.